London, 1974. Rod Stewart was at the top of the world and he knew it. Maggie May had made him untouchable. Sailing was on its way. He was filling arenas where he used to fill clubs, and the distance between those two things felt exactly as large as it was. He didn't think much about Jeff Beck anymore. Not because there was bad blood. There wasn't, not exactly. But because Rod had moved on. You leave a band, you leave a chapter. That's how it works. They had history, the two of them. Real history. Rod had been the voice of the Jeff Beck Group from 1967 to 1969. 2 albums, Truth, Beck Ola, rooms full of noise and sweat and something that felt genuinely dangerous at the time. Jeff on guitar, Rod on vocals, and the shared belief that together they were something neither of them could be alone. When Rod left in 1969, he told people it was about opportunity, about faces, about a solo career that was already pulling at him from the outside. All of that was true. It wasn't a lie to say so, but part of it was something else. The thing Jeff was always reaching for. Rod had never been entirely sure he could follow him there, so Rod had left. Gone to Faces, gone solo, gone somewhere much larger, and Jeff had kept going in his own direction, which was, as always, slightly sideways from everyone else. So when someone mentioned in passing what Jeff was working on now, Rod stopped. "He's making an album with no singer," the person said. Rod looked at them. "No vocals at all, just guitar." There was a pause, the kind that isn't really silence. It's someone deciding what to say while already knowing what they think. "That's not an album," Rod said. "That's a rehearsal tape." He wasn't being cruel. He genuinely believed it. Rod Stewart understood music through the voice. Always had. The guitar was the frame. The voice was the painting. You didn't hang a frame on a wall and call it art. You didn't strip away the one thing that made people feel something and expect them to stay in the room. He'd watched Jeff play enough times to know exactly what the man could do with 6 strings. That wasn't the question. The question was whether what a guitarist could do was ever enough on its own. Technique was a road. It still needed somewhere to go. It still needed a voice at the end of it to tell you what the journey had meant. And feeling, Rod believed, came from words. From a throat, from breath, from something that sounded undeniably human. "People need something to hold on to," Rod had said once in a different context, about a different argument. "They need a voice, something that sounds like them." He meant it. It wasn't a pose. It was his entire philosophy of what music was for. Jeff would make a nice record, a musician's record. Jazz critics might appreciate it. Certain guitarists would buy it and study it the way you study a textbook. But it wouldn't reach anyone real. It would be a curiosity, the kind of album people respect without ever actually listening to twice. That was Rod's honest assessment. He didn't call Jeff to say any of this. Jeff Beck didn't make announcements. He didn't explain himself to anyone who hadn't asked, and even then he kept it short. There was no press release about what he was attempting, no statement about artistic vision, no interview where he laid out the concept and waited for the room to weigh in. He went into the studio. The sessions for what would become Blow by Blow began in late 1974 at AIR Studios in London, with George Martin producing. Yes, that George Martin, the man who had shaped the sound of the Beatles across a decade, who understood arrangement the way other people understand breathing. That detail alone said something about the weight of what Jeff was attempting. This wasn't a side project. This wasn't filler. This was the album. Jeff had been building toward it for years without quite naming it. Every time a vocalist had stood between him and what he was trying to say, something had slipped in translation. Not because the vocalists were wrong. Rod hadn't been wrong. Rod had been exceptional. But Jeff's guitar had always been reaching for something that words kept interrupting. A feeling that existed just past the edge of what language could carry, just past the point where lyrics ran out of room. Now there were no words. Just the guitar. And George Martin, who understood space and texture and the particular weight of silence in a way that very few producers ever had. Martin didn't push Jeff toward anything. He created the right conditions and then stepped back. He trusted the guitar to finish its own sentences. They worked slowly, deliberately. Jeff would play something, stop, play it again differently, then a third time with some small shift in touch or timing that only he could hear the reason for. He wasn't hunting for perfection. He was hunting for the feeling that told him he was finished, a different thing entirely. When he found it, he moved on without ceremony. He didn't talk about what he was doing. There was nothing to explain. The music either said it or it didn't. The album came out in March 1975. Rod heard it somewhere. A friend's house, a car, a record player in a room he happened to be passing through. The details shifted depending on who told the story and when. But the moment itself never shifted. The moment was fixed. He sat down. Not immediately. He kept moving for a few seconds while the first track settled into the air around him. And then something made him stop. Made him actually stop walking and just stand there and listen properly for the first time. It wasn't flashy. That was the first thing that registered. Jeff wasn't showing off. He was saying something, clearly, directly, without decoration, and the absence of words made it louder somehow, not quieter. The empty space where a voice should have been wasn't a gap. It was a room you could actually enter. By the second track, Rod had sat down. By the third, he hadn't moved. There was a guitar part somewhere in the middle of the album. He'd later never quite be able to identify which track, which moment, that bent a note in a direction that felt like the end of a sentence. Not a guitar sentence, a human sentence. The kind that trails off because the speaker already knows the listener understands. Because to finish it out loud would actually make it smaller. Rod had always believed you needed a voice for that. A real voice, a throat, breath, something that came from a person. He was sitting with the evidence that he'd been wrong. The album went top 5 in the UK, top 5 in the United States. It went platinum. It sold to people who didn't buy instrumental records, who had never bought instrumental records, who would have told you with confidence that they didn't even like instrumental records. It reached people. Rod heard about the numbers and pieces, the way you absorb information you'd rather not examine all at once. A friend mentioned the chart position. Someone else mentioned the reviews. And the reviews were not qualified praise, not the respectful, but distant acknowledgement of something niche. They were the kind written when something genuinely shifts the understanding of what a guitar can do. George Martin gave an interview and called it one of the most satisfying projects he'd ever been part of. Rod didn't say anything publicly. He had learned, somewhere in those years between small clubs and sold-out arenas, that not every thought needed to be spoken. Some things you kept. Some things you filed away under a heading you didn't visit too often. This one went under. Things I was completely certain about that turned out not to be true. Jeff never mentioned Rod's comment. It's not clear he ever knew Rod had made it. And if he did know, if someone had passed it along the way, people inevitably pass these things along, usually dressed up as concern. He gave no sign. Jeff didn't collect grievances. They seemed to slide off him, or perhaps they simply didn't stick because he wasn't paying attention in that direction. He was paying attention to the guitar. He always was. There was something musicians noticed about Jeff in the studio, the ones who'd worked alongside him across different projects in different decades. He was never performing. Even alone in a booth with the tape rolling and the red light on, he wasn't performing. He was listening to the note that had just happened, to the space where the next one might go, to the question the last phrase had left unanswered, and whether the answer wanted to be fast or slow or quiet or not there at all. It made him difficult to work with if what you needed was efficiency and a schedule. It made him impossible to follow if what you needed was something to prove. Years later, Rod spoke about Jeff in an interview. The specific year varied, but the substance didn't change. He was asked about the Jeff Beck group, those 2 albums, that window of time, what it had meant to him looking back. Rod was generous. He was often generous about his past when enough distance had accumulated and the old competitions no longer felt urgent. Jeff was something else entirely, Rod said. I knew it then, but I didn't fully understand it. He paused. Blow by Blow is one of the records I go back to. I've gone back to it more times than I can count. Another pause, shorter. I thought you needed a voice. I was certain that was the only way music like that could work. Jeff showed me I was thinking about it wrong. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The album had already said everything. Jeff Beck died in January 2023. Rod posted a tribute the same day. No long statement. No carefully arranged words designed to sound like exactly the right thing. Just a few sentences. What Jeff had meant to him, what those years together had given him, what it felt like to know that particular guitar was gone from the world now. One line stood out. He never needed anyone to speak for him. It was true. It had always been true. Rod had just taken a little longer to hear it. People ask sometimes what Blow by Blow actually proved. The simple answer is that it proved an instrumental album could reach people who didn't know they were looking for one. That's the chart answer, the commercial answer, the one that gets cited in music history books. But there's another answer underneath that one. Quieter. It takes longer to arrive at. It proved that if you have something real to say, the form doesn't determine whether it lands. The container doesn't decide the content. You can strip away every convention, every safety net, every element that was supposed to be non-negotiable. And if what remains underneath is honest, it survives. It more than survives. Rod Stewart had a voice that could fill arenas on 3 continents. A voice people paid real money to be in the same room with. A voice that had convinced millions they were hearing something true. Jeff Beck had 10 fingers and a piece of wood with 6 wires stretched across it. And in 1975, the piece of wood said something the voice hadn't managed yet. Rod knew it the moment he sat down and stopped moving. He just needed the record to teach him first. That's the thing his closest collaborators always came back to, in their own words, in their own time, across different decades and different contexts. Jeff didn't argue. He didn't explain. He didn't try to convince anyone of anything. He played. And if you were paying attention, you got it. And if you weren't, well, the tape was still rolling.